published it yet.
I want to hear this because Bill went to their book launch last week. I want to hear a bit of this.
I really don't know because I haven't tried to buy one myself. I'm going to get one. But I was told that Mike Fitzpatrick is selling them on his website, and supposedly that's a good place to go buy them. But I really don't know him. And
Okay, thank you anyway.
if it's not up on, it should be up on Amazon. If it's not, it's gonna.
No, it's not up on Amazon yet, but it was on another website, and I mean it was very reasonable, but they wouldn't accept for I can't remember what it was. They wouldn't accept payment from an overseas place.
Okay.
You could buy it in the States, but you couldn't buy it overseas.
Okay.
Well, okay, that may be if it's a print on demand thing they've got going. Maybe they don't have print on demand available overseas.
That's not true. I'll wait and see. It'll more likely come out soon anyway. So we'll worry about it then.
So now that we have that subject, Bill, how would it go last week for you? Do you want to give us a bit of a snippet into how that went last week? The book, the launch or the signing of the book with Kevin Hanlon and Jay Stinnett and Sally.
Yes.
Yes. You want to give us an
Except it was Eamon, where you're in the UK, right? You're not in Ireland. UK.
That's right,
okay.
UK, yeah.
Can order UK. Okay, I'll ask Jay that, and
Okay.
we'll see what happens.
Thank you.
It was a bit of a trial. It was one of those, it's a Saturday, right? The movie's going to be at 7 o'clock. I checked Waze on Tuesday, an hour and 10 minutes. This guy's picking us up. The president of the board of Stepping Stones is going to pick us up and drive us into the city. Hour and 10 minutes. It took us 2 hours and 20 minutes. I mean, it's the soccer thing and the Knicks and just who the hell knows what's going on. If I had been driving, we would have turned around after 45 minutes and just gone back home and called it a day. Anyhow, we got there and it was, I haven't seen it in 8 or 9 months. It was interesting to see it again. And but there was a small crowd there. I don't know what was going on with that, but that was okay. Always good to see Kevin. And Kevin was there with his sister Barbara, who both my wife and I think kind of walks on water. And we haven't seen her in a decade probably. So anyhow, it was nice. It was nice, but we were happy to be home and out of the craziness. Man, it was crazy down there. Crazy in New York.
What was the book launch? Conscious Contact. Was it a book launch or just a book signing? Is that what it was?
It was just a book signing and showing the movie and selling the book and taking names. And
what was the Q&A like, Bill? Anything jump out at you? Any Q&A? Do you want to share a little bit of Q&A with us before we jump into chapter 20?
No, but it's interesting. Now, this is the third time I've been in one of these deals where they showed the movie and we did a Q&A afterwards. And the first question always is, what can you tell us about Bill and LSD? I was like, and I said, I bitched about that to Joe Chisholm on Monday afterwards. And he said, well, that makes perfect sense. And I said, what? What are you talking about, Joe? He said, anytime you talked about TM, that's a 60s thing, and it goes hand in hand with LSD. So that's the connection people make, and that's where they go. And I was like, oh, okay. I hadn't thought of it that way, but
well, that reminds me, Jim Worley has got us booked to Don Latin, haven't you, Jim, for July? Jim has booked Bill Wilson, Psychedelics and the 12 Steps, presented by Don Latin. Jim Worley, where are you, Amy? Are you still here? Well, Jim is there somewhere. Didn't you book Don Latin in for us, Jim? Jim is muted. Jim Worley is muted. Jim, someone's stuck your... We can't hear you. Jim, you're not the same with it when we can't hear you.
Distilled Spirits was his first one.
That's the one. Distilled Spirits is his first one.
And he has another one. So yeah, we'll be talking about that again. So it's always a good topic. Everybody wants to know about it, and so they want to know all the gossip. They want to know about LSD and royalties and women and all that stuff.
All the legends and the myths, Jim, you're going to be talking about the 31st for us as well, aren't you?
Well, a little bit,
A little bit.
little bit.
Bill Sherbrooke, we're starting we're going to go through your YouTube goodies, all the goodies you have on YouTube.
Oh, yikes. Okay. Hey, listen, in relation to LSD and that sort of stuff, Michael Pollan has a new book out called Consciousness, and Ezra Klein of the New York Times interviewed him for basically an hour and a half on a podcast. And I would recommend that. I've only seen one podcast in the last 5 years, and that was it, because my wife just kept saying, you got to watch this, you got to watch this. Constant references to William James, for instance. Ezra Klein, Michael Pollan, New York Times podcast. It was just awesome. It was awesome.
New York Times. What was his name, Michael?
The author is Michael Pollan, Pollan, but the interviewer is Ezra Klein, who does the other one I haven't looked at that people have been twisting my arm on. Ezra Klein interviews Pema Chodron, and I'm going to get to that. I will get to it. I just got to find an hour and 20 minutes, whatever the hell it is, to do it.
Well, I'm going to be jumping in. I got it. Michael Pollan. Got it. Michael Pollan. So we're getting ready to read chapter 20. We done chapter 1 last week, Bill, when you were away. We went back over chapter 1. I enjoyed that. That was quite good. Refreshers. Who else is aiming us here? Thomas, Steve, Jim. Where's Jim gone on me? Jim, you're gone away again. Is Jim gone?
What? No, I'm here.
Where are you? What are you? Where are you?
What did I do now?
Right. Shall we go straight into it, Bill Sherbrooke, shall we? We got the author, Bill Sherbrooke, with us. Of course, we're writing the big book, The Creation of AA, and we're already into chapter 20. How good is that? There's 31 chapters, of course. So we'll be reading that for another 11 weeks, obviously. Bill might do a presentation for us. What he normally does at the end. I just planting a seed with him now. He might do that. I don't know. So we might get a new presentation from Mr. Sherbrooke at the end of that. But we're going back to November 1938 for now. Chapter 20. Mr. Sherbrooke titled it Hank Parkhurst, Managing Editor and quote-unquote Two Employers. And as I said, November 1938, and it's on page 383 of your Writing the Big Book. So I just open it up by saying, before I go to Jim Worley, of course, is with us with AA history only as well. So Hank Parkhurst may well have been the busiest man in AA during the final months of 1938. In addition to being increasingly distracted with Ruth Hawk, he was trying to sell shares in the 100 Men Corporation while continuing to lay the foundations for a national promotional campaign to coincide with the book's release. Adding to all this frantic activity, Hank was also about to write 2 chapters for the big book, as well as having taken on the job of finding and hiring an editor to review the manuscript once it was completed.
In early November, with most of Bill's time devoted to writing, Hank assumed the role of managing editor. Both men were aware of their status as amateurs and knew it was essential to find someone with some real writing and publishing experience to edit the manuscript before it went to press. Parkhurst, still unhappy with much of what had been written, may well have thought someone with an impressive enough set of credentials might be able to critique the substance of Bill's writing and steer the book more in the psychological direction that he had in mind. But whether or not this was actually part of Hank's agenda, both men agreed the book needed to be reviewed by a professional, and Parkhurst took charge of that phase of the project.
And the first subheading is Potential Editors Eliminated.
Several potential candidates for editor had presented themselves during the past few months. Back in mid-June, Hank and Bill had met with Floyd Parsons, a nationally known writer for the Saturday Evening Post, who agreed to help them edit the work once it was more nearly finished. But Parsons' offer to edit the book was, for some unknown reason, never mentioned again, parentheses. Perhaps Floyd's services were just too expensive, closed parentheses. 4 months later, Parkhurst's only reference to Parsons was in relation to his promise to write an article for the Saturday Evening Post that would coincide with the book's release. Neither of these possibilities ever came to fruition. Within the fellowship, Silas Bent had many years' experience as a professional writer and editor, and he too had offered to edit the book before it was published. Unfortunately, Silas was having trouble just staying sober, and as we have seen, despite his acclaimed reputation as an author, he did not write, and perhaps wasn't even asked to write, his own story for the book. As the work moved swiftly toward completion, Silas Bent was obviously no longer a viable candidate for the job of editor. More recently, one of Bill's friends had given a copy of the first 2 chapters to a man named Arthur Scott, and he marked them up extensively as he read them. In mid-October, he wrote to Wilson telling him that, quote, "As an editor of 15 years' experience, I just could not help editing the manuscript as I went along, and I hope you will pardon this. In any case, what I have done will make the manuscript more acceptable to a printer, though I fear some of the typing will be apt to puzzle him a bit. I've also marked a few queries which need attention," close quote. Scott went on to qualify himself as a former alcoholic who had recovered through a deep and abiding belief in the power of God, telling Bill he wanted to, quote, "offer to you whatever my editorial knowledge and ability may be worth to you in this noble and Christ-like work," close quote. While Arthur's generous offer of his services was perfectly in line with AA's limited resources, it appears that his editorial suggestions were not, and we never hear of him again. If Arthur Scott's letter and his suggested edits were ever brought to Hank's attention, he dismissed him as a potential candidate, deciding to find a much more qualified and far less religious editor for the book. None of these people fit the profile Hank was looking for in an editor. He felt the book needed and deserved the best critical review, and he was committed to finding the most experienced and professional editor possible. To his mind, a proper editing job, one that improved whatever amateurish mistakes they might have made while writing, was the critical step needed for the book to become a bestseller. And as usual, Parkhurst had set his sights very high. He wasn't just looking for a bestseller. He actually had serious hopes their book would become a Book of the Month Club selection, something that would guarantee them immediate nationwide exposure and a truly huge initial sale.
2 editors chosen.
With these criteria in mind, Hank began his search for a professional to review, critique, and correct their book. But rather than hiring just one editor, Parkhurst rather quickly decided on 2. Thomas H. Usel would review the overall format of the book, while Janet M. Blair would more minutely edit the text. Usel may have suggested this creative approach, dividing the editorial responsibilities between himself, a prominent and expensive literary critic, and Blair, a qualified but less prestigious and therefore less costly text editor, would effectively reduce the overall expense of the editorial work and keep the costs within AA's limited budget. Lois later claimed that Usel was someone, quote, "whom Hank knew," end quote, but she offers no further details on what the relationship might have been. By far, the simplest explanation of how Parkhurst knew Usel would be that he was a teacher at the NYU Writing School, where around this time, Parkhurst and Hawk were taking a semester's worth of classes on how to write short stories. While the plausibility of this scenario is supported only by circumstantial evidence and inference, it is certainly the least complicated explanation of how Hank might have met Tom Usel, and it might also help explain how he was introduced to Janet Blair. As we will see shortly, it is possible Usel knew Janet Blair through a mutual acquaintance, so it is not unlikely that Tom was the person who recommended her to Parkhurst. Even more speculative, but still within the realm of possibilities, would be that Blair was one of the teachers at Usel's own writing school, and when he recommended her to Parkhurst. In a telling comment, Ruth Hawk once noted that the Big Book was, quote, edited by a New York editor and his office staff, end quote. If this is true, then Janet Blair was that office staff. There are certainly other ways to explain how Parkhurst might have met and hired Usel and Blair as complementary editors, but the New York University scenario is the most appealing for its simplicity and for the way it fits so neatly with the known facts, few though they may be.
Tom Usel to help shape the book. Now, however they met, the first person Hank chose to help shape the book was Thomas H. Usel, a 54-year-old author, an established critic with an impressive list of literary accomplishments. In an early January letter to Bill Wilson, Hank enumerated his credentials.
Mr. Thomas H. Usel, former editor, Collier's Magazine, writer of several books, contributor to Collier's, Saturday Evening Post, etc. As you know, hardly a year goes past when one of Mr. Usel's writers do not appear on the bestsellers list. Incidentally, this might be interesting to you. Such books as The Good Earth, If I Had Four Apples, The Outward Room, 3 Book of the Month Club books, and bestsellers for months after publishing were submitted to him for criticism and final designing. In the publishing and literary world, I know there is no one so well established and looked up to as Mr. Usel.
Tom Usel regularly placed advertisements in writing magazines offering, quote, professional training, end quote, to new writers, along with his services as a freelance, quote, literary critic, end quote, or those with finished manuscripts. If he and Hank did not meet through the NYU writing school then, Parkhurst may have located him by responding to one of these many ads. In one, Usel detailed his experiences as an editor, published author, and writing teacher, and then under a bold headline entitled, quote-unquote, selling talk, he encouraged unpublished authors to contact him for advice, quote, because I know my business, analyzing, collaborating, selling, because my reports are absolutely honest, prompt, and sympathetic. Thousands of unarrived writers have come to me for help. Why not you? End quote. And there is a footnote there, which we're not reading this time around. His resume was certainly impressive, and this was exactly the kind of quote-unquote closer sales question that would have caught Hank's attention if he had read that particular ad. It is also possible Tom Usel came to Parkhurst's attention through a more personal recommendation. In his description of Usel's accomplishments noted above, Hank mentions that he had been involved in the, quote, criticism and final design, end quote, of The Good Earth. This suggests Parkhurst may have first heard about Tom Usel from Richard Walsh, the head of John Day Publishing Company, publisher of The Good Earth, during their long meeting the previous month. Among all the other topics covered in that informative session, with this candid and extremely helpful industry insider, one of Hank's questions may have been, quote, so who might be a good person to edit our book? And Tom Usel could have been Richard Walsh's answer, Mr. Sherbrooke.
But however Parkhurst made the connection with him, Usel's professional credentials were remarkable, attesting to his long and successful career as both writer and editor. From the 1910s to the 1930s, he was a regular contributor to an impressive list of magazines, including the Saturday Evening Post, Scribner's, Mumsies, and Writer's Digest, Women's Home Companion, the Saturday Review, the American Scholar, and North American Review and Collier's, parenthesis, where he served as fiction editor for 2 years, close parenthesis. In addition, his books at this time included Narrative Technique, 1923, and Writing as a Career, 1938. The first of these, the textbooks on writing, was so popular that went through several editions over the next 3 decades. As might be expected of a man with such noteworthy experience and high reputation, Tom Usel's services were not inexpensive. In the magazine ad for his services as literary critic, under the rather direct and challenging header entitled, What the Truth Costs, Usel tells his potential customers his, quote, fees for a single manuscript is $5 for 5,000 words or less and $1 1,000 above that, end quote. This make it easy to calculate how much his services would cost if Hank Parkhurst hired him for the job. Since the front half of the book in the multiverse printing was just under 5,000 words and the story section slightly less than that, Usel's estimated bill for the most basic literary review of the book would have been roughly $100. Finally, it's worth mentioning that in his role as teacher and literary critic, Tom Usel was a great debunker of the quote-unquote holy mystery of writing and of the quote-unquote genius of writers. He once claimed, quote, "If there is such a thing as literary gift, meaning any endowment that comes without working at it, I have never been able to find it after years of working with both literary successes and failures." In support of this, he asserted that his firm belief that, quote, "the people that succeeded at authorship seem to have something to say with energy and egotism to say it and need the money. These qualifications come pretty close to being those needed for success in any profession or business." It would be hard to imagine a better description of the situation Wilson and Parkhurst found themselves in. They clearly had something important to say. There was no lack of energy or egotism in what they said, and they were very much in need of the money. Tom Usel's credentials as professional editor met all of Hank's criteria, and his supremely confident tone, parentheses, he once referred to himself in an ad as, quote, "the foremost American teacher of creative writing," end quote, close parenthesis, would have also spoken directly to Parker's own perspective on the world. On so many different levels, Thomas H. Usel was his perfect candidate for this job.
Janet Blair is text editor.
But before he actually met with Usel, Hank had lunch with his second candidate, the woman he hoped would become editor for the text of the manuscript. This was the 61-year-old Janet Blair, who had served as secretary to several famous authors throughout her long career in New York City, and who later ran a secretarial school based in her home in Peekskill, New York, 45 miles due north of New York City on the Hudson River. But during late 1938, Janet was clearly open to assuming a variety of freelance jobs to help support her family. Over the previous 2 decades in New York, Janet had worked as secretary for a number of academics and authors with occasional breaks in her employment as demanded by ongoing family issues. For instance, throughout 1916 and into early 1917, Blair was secretary to the author Ida Tarbell, who then left her employ for several months to have a baby. Returning to the job in early 1918, she managed Tarbell's busy schedule and her correspondence for the next 3 years. 10 years later, she was once again working for Tarbell and continued to do so for approximately 2 more years. Beyond that, the two women remained distant friends, exchanging birthday wishes and Christmas cards, and occasionally scheduling lunch dates when they both happened to be in New York City at the same time. It is more than a little ironic that Hank Parkhurst would even consider Janet Blair for this job, given her long personal history and close relationship with Ida Tarbell. From the mid-1920s onward, Tarbell wrote primarily as a Lincoln scholar, with many books and magazine articles about the 16th president to her credit. But throughout the first half of her career, she was the most famous of the, quote, muckrakers, close quote, the name given to early 20th century magazine writers who specialized in sensational exposés of the disreputable, destructive, and even criminal business practices so common in American capitalism at that time. As such, Tarbell almost single-handedly invented the profession of, quote, investigative journalist, close quote, and she had done so most prominently in her brilliant, merciless, and scathing exposé of the Standard Oil Company. This she published in a series of 19 articles, serialized over 2 years in McClure's magazine, starting in 1902, and then put into book form as The History of the Standard Oil Company in 1904. Ida Tarbell was not just famous, she was positively notorious as the woman who had publicly humiliated and exposed John D. Rockefeller Sr., characterizing him as a mean-spirited, miserly, money-grubbing man who was perhaps the cruelest, most vicious, and most untrustworthy titan of industry the country had ever produced. As noted in one brief biography of her,
Tarbell kept the series in McClure's with a two-part character study that revealed her fixation with the man she had been studying for the better part of 5 years. Focusing on Rockefeller's weary appearance, she called him, quote, the oldest man in the world, a living mummy, close quotes, and accused him of being, quote, money mad and, quote, a hypocrite. Quote, our national life is on every side distinctly poorer, uglier, meaner for the kind of influence he exercises, close quotes, she concluded. Rockefeller was deeply hurt by this last attack from, quote, that poisonous woman, close quotes, as he called her, but he refused to engage in any public rebuttal of her allegations. Quote, not a word, close quotes, he told his advisors, quote, not a word about that misguided woman, close quotes.
It is possible Hank Parkhurst was unaware of Blair's connection with Tarbell, but that seems improbable since it was almost certainly the most prominent and important item on her resume. And if Hank did know about this connection, it is a wonder he didn't worry about the consequences once the Rockefeller people discovered he had hired an editor who was so closely associated with the family's single greatest enemy. If Parkhurst was at all bothered by this potential problem, he dismissed it, for whatever reason, as being irrelevant to his decision to hire Mrs. Janet Blair on her own merits. The other famous person Blair had worked for during this time was the academic Walter B. Pitkin, who in 1932 authored the immensely popular Life Begins at 40, a bestseller in 1933. Pitkin's book was a publishing phenomenon, becoming the #1 nonfiction bestseller in 1933 and staying on that list in #2 position throughout 1934. Walter Pitkin had taught philosophy and psychology during his first 5 years at Columbia University, but then spent the next 30 years, from 1912 to 1943, as one of the most famous teachers in their renowned School of Journalism. More than a little intriguing is the fact that Tom Usel had worked for Walter Pitkin for 2 years in the early 1920s as his quote-unquote associate and manager, a position that required Tom to frequently, quote, substitute for him in Columbia School of Journalism fiction classes, end quote. The first ads Usel ran for his mail-order writing course in 1922 actually claimed that he was teaching, quote, a new method that had been devised by Professor Walter B. Pitkin, the leading university teacher in the field, end quote. While this connection may have been just coincidental, it is possible Blair and Usel knew each other through their mutual relationship with Walter Pitkin. And if so, this might be another avenue whereby Tom Usel knew and recommended Janet Blair to Hank Parkhurst. However Hank was introduced to Janet Blair, they met for lunch, most likely on Friday, November 4th, and he was so impressed that he offered her the job. In a long letter written on Monday, November 7th, Parkhurst promised to send her a check later that same week as a retainer, confirming their arrangement. He also told her he had discussed her quote-unquote criticism fee with Mr. Wilson, and we both agree that you are eminently fair and thank you for your real generosity, end quote. This suggests that Hank had negotiated a reduction in Blair's regular fees based either on A's limited budget or on the worthiness of their life-saving program, or both. In that same letter, Parkhurst went into some detail about the current state of the writing project and his estimation of when it would be finished.
According to schedule, Mr. Wilson will be through with the first write of the book by December 5th. As you know, there is a considerable portion of our group in Akron. Before starting to rewrite, Mr. Wilson wants to go over the contents of the book carefully with the people out there. In setting up our calendar, we have allowed ample time, and there is a good possibility that we may be 2 weeks ahead of schedule. However, December 19th is the day we have set when we expect Mr. Wilson to have a complete first write of the book with full suggestions from the Akron group.
Subsequent events would prove this schedule to be unrealistic. The manuscript was nowhere near complete on December 5th. Parentheses, it is even uncertain whether the 12 steps had been written by that time, let alone the 2 chapters based on them, close parentheses. Nor did Bill ever get out to Ohio for consultation with the Akron contingent in December. That didn't happen until March 1st, a full month after he had turned the manuscript over to Janet Blair for editing in early February. Hank followed this with a rather offhanded comment that revealed a number of things about his recent activities. Quote, as you know, I'm going to have a talk with Mr. Ussel in regard to the format of the book, and this will be covered within the next 2 weeks, close quote. Parkhurst had clearly already decided to hire Tom Ussel prior to this lunch, and he told Blair about Ussel's involvement during that meeting, explaining their different areas of responsibility within the project. His plan to hire 2 editors charged with different tasks was obviously already in place before Parkhurst met with Blair. Having confirmed her employment, outlined the probable work schedule, and reaffirmed the dual responsibilities for editing the book, Hank then asked about the best way to proceed going forward.
Now, what is the soundest procedure for us to follow? Should we wait until the first write is completed and until Mr. Wilson has finished his Akron checkup and then rewritten and sharpened up the entire book, which we figure will be done by January 1st, before submitting it to you? Or should we begin to send chapters along to you now? As you agreed at lunch the other day, it would not be well for the author to have these suggestions until he is through with his first write. On the other hand, it might save time for you, and it might get the book more thoroughly in your mind if we begin to send along first writes to you. What are your suggestions?
It is interesting to note that Parkhurst says Blair had told him at lunch that, quote, it would not be well for the author to have these suggestions until he is through with his first writes, close quote. But he still wonders whether or not they quote, should begin to send such chapters along to you now, close quote, and then asks for her thoughts on the matter. Perhaps you had to be at the lunch meeting to fully understand this paragraph, but it very much sounds as if Hank is asking Janet to reconsider a firm opinion that she had already offered him on the subject. Finally, Parkhurst asks if it would be helpful for Blair to actually meet and talk with Bill Wilson before she begins this project.
What do you think of bringing Mr. Wilson up to see you at your office in Peekskill, or meeting him sometime in New York? He has an absorbing story to tell you, which would probably consume 3 or 4 hours. Would this affect your criticism, or would you prefer to wait and hear about it all later? I ask this from the standpoint of the book, as I know you are intensely interested from a personal standpoint and want to meet him.
Blair's reply has not been preserved, so there's no way of knowing what her response might have been to all of these questions. But much of that reply would have been based on Hank's proposed schedule, which began to slip almost immediately. Whether Janet Blair and Bill Wilson ever met is unknown. The letter makes clear, however, that Hank was planning to meet with Tom Ussel within 2 weeks, and in all likelihood that meeting took place as scheduled. But all of these deadlines would be pushed back significantly over the next several weeks, and it would be 3 months before Janet Blair ever received a copy of the manuscript for editing. But what is most important in this letter is the clear evidence that Parkhurst had taken complete control of the editing process and had already engaged 2 people to do their respective jobs in relation to the manuscript. Hank would continue to act as managing editor of the book right up until the day it was published.
Hank finally sells some stock.
Besides assembling his team to edit the book, Parkhurst spent the first 2 weeks of November diligently trying to sell shares of stock in the 100 Men Corporation. Using typed copies of the sales prospectus he had created, Hank talked to as many people as he could, hoping to convince them to invest in this outstanding new opportunity. But even with the glowing promises made in his initial sales offering, closing these deals proved to be more difficult than he had expected. During his first burst of energetic selling, Hank did convince one company and 7 different people to purchase 26 shares of $25 stock outright. The biggest investor, Stain Ox Corporation, the company that made the auto polish marketed by Honor Dealers, bought 8 shares. Another 18 shares went to business friends and associates, open parentheses, including William Curry, one of the original investors in Honor Dealers, and Clayton Qua, Bill Wilson's former employer, close parentheses, and one lone member of AA, parentheses, Norman Hunt, bought a single share, close parentheses. This generated a much needed $650 in ready cash to help with Parkhurst's ongoing expenses. But as Bill Wilson had noted in his Sheep and Goats letter late September, Hank was already in debt to the tune of $2,000, and he needed at least $600 a month just to maintain his own household and the office in Newark. While $650 was certainly a positive and much appreciated infusion of cash, it was too little too late to get Hank even close to caught up on his bills. An additional 7 buyers could only afford to buy a total of 34 shares once Hank had offered them his quote-unquote $5 a month for 5 months payment plan. 3 of these investors were members of the New York Fellowship, and the other 4 were either their friends or relatives. George Williams, open parentheses, who reportedly got sober the previous June, close parentheses, bought 12 shares on time, while Bill Rudell and Herb Taylor committed to purchase 5 shares each over the next 5 months. The remaining stock was bought by Herb Taylor's mother, 5 shares, and one of his business associates, 4 shares, and 2 of Bill Rudell's friends, who purchased 1 and 2 shares respectively. The first payments for all of these bought-on-time investments were due on November 15th and could be counted on to generate $170 in cash every month for Hank from November through March, if payments were actually made on time. If the $650 already received for outright purchases was budgeted over the next 5 months, that is $130 a month, and added to this time payment income, Parkhurst would have a monthly income of $300, just half of the amount he needed to stay solvent, but better than nothing. At this point, a careful analysis of the 1940 stock subscriber list shows something surprising. These 60 shares, bought by 14 different people and one company, were all purchased before November 15th, 1938, and Hank did not sell any more shares of stock between that date and the first week of January 1939. Clearly, his efforts to sell more stock in the 100 Men Corporation were completely suspended during the last 6 weeks of the year, as his energies were redirected to his own writings for the book, the organization of the editorial review team, the arguments that would surface and dominate the fellowship throughout December once the 12 steps were written, and the final assembly of a review manuscript for Tom Uzzell.
Bill Wilson lets Hank Parkhurst write quote-unquote 2 employers.
However little acceptance Hank may have so far received for his ideas about the proper contents of the big book, he was now given the opportunity to do some writing of his own for the book. And he was hoping he would be able to show Bill Wilson some concrete examples of how he thought that job should have been done all along. When it came to business matters, Wilson consistently deferred to Parkhurst's greater expertise, freely acknowledging his much more extensive experience within the corporate world. Bill had never held a job managing a large number of people, nor did he ever regularly report to a more senior person within a corporate structure. Hank, on the other hand, had spent most of his professional life immersed in just such a large and hierarchical business environment. It was the place where his sales and leadership skills had been developed and perfected over the years. In his last job with Standard Oil of New Jersey, Parkhurst had been an assistant wholesale manager being paid a handsome salary of $40,000 a year. In this important and lucrative position, he was responsible for the performance of 6,600 salesmen servicing 28,000 dealers, whose sales he then had to justify to his own manager. Who then was more qualified than Parkhurst to write a chapter entitled "To Employers"? Not only was Hank's business experience far superior to anyone else then sober in AA, he had also proven to be one of the most successful members in delivering the message of recovery to businessmen who drank too much. In late September, when Bill wrote to Frank Amos reporting that Parkhurst was then busy with fundraising and publicity efforts, but also, quote, doing a great deal in the general work where he is most effective with businessmen of his own type. In Montclair, where he lives, 3 men of this description came to his attention only yesterday through his family position, end quote. In every respect, Hanks was the group's most experienced and competent member when dealing with business and with businessmen. In addition, Bill must have been relieved to admit that there was at least one chapter of the book that he could defer to Hank. Here was perhaps the best way to ease some of the constant pressure coming from Parkhurst about what was being written. Let him do some of his own writing for the book. Hank was anxious to make a significant contribution, and To Employers was the logical place for Bill to give him free rein to do just that. Finally, this was to be Hank's chapter because of his passionate commitment to the pet theory that large corporations would be more receptive to their new solution than anyone else. Parkhurst firmly believed that with whatever time and money a company spent to get a talented employee sober, that investment would be generously returned to them as soon as the recovered man was back on the job. Bill did an excellent job of describing Hank's logic on this topic in an August 1938 letter.
We have found that the type of alcoholic who recovers most readily is the man who has begun to get someplace in business and then is cut down by this hellish sickness. It is logical, therefore, for us to approach the large corporation in this country as a source of the proposed prospect for our group. They spend thousands in training a man and then are obliged to toss him onto a scrap heap. Sometimes he's very hard to replace. Our experience tells us that just before or just after they have tossed him onto a scrap heap, we could set maybe as high as 50% of those fellows back in the ring with a punch such as they never had before. Hence, for a corporation or its officers personally to foster this sort of effort would not only be humanitarian, it should be good for business.
The key point here, and in the chapter Hank would write, is that in addition to any altruistic considerations, it just made good business sense to invest in a man's recovery. Rather than firing this once valuable employee as an incorrigible drunk and an irredeemable liability, wouldn't it make better sense for the company to help him turn his life around and once again become a valuable asset to the corporation? Hank's early June outline for the book had captured the essence of this and provided a framework for what would be covered in his chapter. Quote, herein, employers will be given the new view of alcoholism as it affects their interests. Many specific suggestions will be made as to how, in the best interest of all, the employer may handle the myriad situations which are so baffling to him at the present. That would have been Hank's chapter number 22 in the outline for the book from June 1938. That outline suggestion would provide the basic content for the chapter. But that still left Bill with one glaring problem: Hank's atrocious writing style. Given the rather staid and conservative target audience for this chapter, Parkhurst would not be experimenting with any of the more flamboyant techniques he had so recently learned in school, such as the stream of consciousness presentation he had already used when writing his own story for the book. But then Hank's normal prose style could be quite as torturous as even this more extravagant attempt at creative writing. Bill was aware of this, and he resolved the problem by claiming the right to edit Hank's chapter as he saw fit, noting, quote, parenthesis, as he had once told Lois, close parenthesis, that, quote, he thought the book, except for the story, should all be written in the same style, end quote. It was difficult to argue with this insistence on the need for uniformity. Certainly, readers should not be forced to make adjustments to different writing styles as each new chapter unfolded. Ruth Hock provides striking testimony to Bill's reservations about Hank's writing in something she wrote to Wilson in late 1955. They had been exchanging letters about A's early history, and in one of them she told Bill that she had just remembered, quote, the fact that Hank wrote the first draft of the chapter to employers, but that you corrected it and in a sense rewrote it in your own words, end quote. Whatever Hank might write, Bill was committed to making sure it blended seamlessly with all the other chapters. This presents the reader of To Employers, as printed in the multilith copy, with a challenging problem: how to tell what parts should be ascribed to Hank Parkhurst's original draft versus those that could be credited to Bill Wilson's later rewrite.
Original outline abandoned.
Using the same technique he had employed for To Wives, Bill opens To Employers with an introductory statement presenting the author of the chapter to the reader. Quote, one of our friends whose gripping story you have read has spent much of his life in the world of big business. He has hired and fired hundreds of men. He knows the alcoholic as the employer sees him. His present views ought to prove exceptionally useful to businessmen everywhere. But let him tell you, close quote. Curious here is the fact that Bill informs the reader he's already read the personal story of the man writing To Employers. In other words, whenever Wilson wrote this introduction, he was still under the impression that they would be following the sequence and organizational format called for in Parkhurst's original outline for the book. That is, with the personal stories preceding all but one of the general chapters. Unfortunately, there is no further evidence to indicate when this particular sentence may have been written. It can only be said that by late December or early January, when the typescript of the book was submitted to the editor Tom Uzzell, this format had been abandoned, with all of the personal stories, including Wilson's, now appearing after the general chapters. Surprisingly, this bit of misinformation about having already read Hank's story, actually nothing more than a typo at this point, managed to survive ongoing edits and made its way into the multilith copy, being corrected only at the last minute, just before the printing of the book. It would be interesting, and perhaps even important, to know exactly when and how this decision to abandon Hank's original format for the book was made. But unfortunately, there is no mention of that decision in any of the contemporary documents, nor in any of the later writings or comments by the participants.
Writing the chapter.
Following a double space to indicate a new writer, Hank Parkhurst opens the chapter by immediately establishing his business credentials. Quote, I was at one time assistant manager of a corporation department employing 6,600 men, end quote. He then immediately proceeds to tell the dramatic stories of 3 men he fired for drinking, each of whom committed suicide. One jumped from a hotel window, another put a shotgun in his mouth and pulled the trigger, and the third hung himself in the family woodshed. This fate, Hank says, may well have been his own, if it were not for, quote, the intervention of an understanding person, end quote, who gave him a new perspective on alcoholism and thereby saved his life. Without even pausing to mourn this tragic loss of human life and the profound effect it must have had on those 3 men's families, parenthesis, this was obviously not going to be a chapter that pandered to the emotions, close parenthesis, Parkhurst immediately leaps into a bold outline of his basic argument. Quote, my downfill cost the business community unknown thousands of dollars, for it takes real money to train a man for an executive position. This kind of waste goes on unabated. Our business fabric is shot through with it, and nothing will stop it but better understanding all around, end quote. Hank goes on to say how difficult it can be for the employer to develop a correct understanding of the alcoholic. He notes that despite the fact that, quote, nearly every modern employer feels a moral responsibility for the well-being of his help, end quote, and would like to do the best he can for all of his employees, misunderstandings about the true nature of the problem all too often get in the way when it comes to dealing with men who are plagued by drink. Rather than just explaining this difficulty, Hank dramatically demonstrates it with the real-life story of one of his friends, a bank executive who had struggled to deal with an alcoholic coworker. Hearing about his friend's situation, Parker spent, quote, 2 hours talking with him about alcoholism, the malady. I described the symptoms and supported my statements with plenty of evidence, end quote. All to no avail. His business friend was sure the man was done drinking because he had recently, quote, taken a cure, looks fine, and to cinch the matter, the board of directors told him that this was his last chance, end quote. Parkhurst scoffed at this naive optimism, claiming that unless the man was brought into, quote, contact with some of our alcoholic crowd, end quote, or at least given a chance to hear his story, he would soon be headed for, quote, a bigger bust than ever, end quote. But this advice was rejected out of hand, and Hank realized that despite his best efforts during this 2-hour conversation, quote, my banking acquaintance had missed the point entirely, end quote. The result, he said, was exactly as he had predicted. Quote, presently, the man did slip and of course was fired, end quote. The upside of this story only came after AA members contacted the man following his dismissal and, quote, he accepted our principles and procedure, end quote. Because of his willingness to change, he now found himself, quote, on the high road to recovery, end quote. But the man had been fired rather than being offered this simple new solution. Hank was not just frustrated, he was indignant. How could his friend, an accomplished and intelligent businessman, be so blind to his arguments and personal testimony about the subtlety and power of this disease? Quote, to me, this incident indicates a lack of understanding and knowledge on the part of employers, lack of understanding as to what really ails the alcoholic, and lack of knowledge as to what part employers might possibly profitably take in salvaging their sick employees, end quote. Addressing the first point, how an employer could ever come to understand, quote, what really ails, end quote, the alcoholic, Parkhurst insists it must begin with the employer disregarding absolutely everything he knows about drinking. Quote, whether you are a hard drinker, a moderate drinker, or a teetotaler, to you, alcohol is no real problem. You cannot see why it should be to anyone else save for the spineless or the stupid, end quote. But Hank stresses that this kind of attitude is useless when dealing with an alcoholic. The employer must constantly fight against his, quote, unquote, ingrained annoyance that the alcoholic could be so weak, stupid, and irresponsible, end quote. To do this is a grave and often fatal misunderstanding of the problem. Instead, Hank says, you must remember, quote, that your employee is very ill, end quote, and, quote, seldom as weak and irresponsible as he appears, unquote, to you. The second point, understanding what employers can do to help their drinking employee, is more complicated. Having readily acknowledged his ignorance of alcoholism, the employer must then decide whether or not the drunken employee is worth saving. On this issue, Hanks thinks there can be little question. Quote, take a look at the alcoholic in your organization. Is he not usually brilliant, fast-thinking, imaginative, and likable? When sober, does he not work hard and have a knack for getting things done, end quote? The implication is that, of course, it makes sense to rehabilitate and save such a valuable asset. Once this decision is made, quote, whether the reason be humanitarian or business or both, then you will wish to know what to do, end quote. As a first step in that process, Hank contends that the employer must be willing to reconsider his existing misapprehensions to the point where he can concede that this, quote, employee is ill, end quote, but still valuable to the company and as such worth forgiving, quote, what he has done in the past, end quote. He asks the employer to consider whether or not he can, quote, shelve the resentment he may hold against his past absurdities. Can he fully appreciate that the man has been a victim of crooked thinking directly caused by action of alcohol on his brain, end quote? This last observation is followed by some extremely dubious medical testimony, even for 1938, about how drinking can increase the, quote, pressure of the spinal fluid, end quote, thereby creating, quote, a fevered brain, end quote, which is the cause of the alcoholic's irrational actions. Whatever nonsensical, quote unquote, scrapes an employer may discover in an alcoholic's past behavior, parenthesis, and there may be some quote unquote pretty messy ones, close parenthesis, he must accept that as these as the result of alcohol's abnormal impact on his brain. The drinking employee needs understanding and forgiveness, not censure. Hank then warns the employer about the man who really does not want to stop, but who is more than willing to take advantage of, quote, your attempt to understand and help, end quote. If you find yourself with such an employee, he says, quote, you may as well discharge him, and the sooner the better, end quote. But these, he says, tend to be the exceptions. Quote, there are many men who want to stop right now, and with them you can go far. If you make a start, you should be prepared to go the limit, not in the sense that any great expense or trouble is to be expensed, but rather in the matter of your own attitude, your understanding of treatment of the case, end quote. Once again, the employer's need to properly understand is pointed out as a critical element. Hank now begins to lay out step-by-step directions, parenthesis, similar to those found in working with others, close parenthesis, for how to approach a drinking employee. First, qualify your prospect. Does he really want to stop drinking, and will he, quote, go to any extreme to do so, end quote? Parkhurst gives detailed instructions here on difficult questions that might be asked by the alcoholic employee, and he offers explicit warnings about the tactics and strategies that are often used by lying and insincere drinkers when challenged in this way. Once the employer is convinced the man is sincere, he should tell him that, quote, a certain amount of physical treatment is desirable, even imperative. If he accepts this definite course of action, offer, quote, to advance the cost of treatment if necessary, but make it plain that any expense will later be deducted from his pay. Make him fully responsible. It is much better for him, end quote. Finally, if he accepts the proposal, point out to him that
physical treatment is but a small part of the picture. Though you are providing him with the best possible medical attention, he should understand that he must undergo a change of heart. To get over drinking will require a transformation of thought and attitude. He must place recovery above everything, even home and business, for without recovery, he will lose both.
Hank follows this bit of ambitious advice, parenthesis, it is quite frankly hard to imagine an employer credibly informing an employee that he must, quote unquote, undergo a change of heart and, quote unquote, a transformation of thought and attitude based on nothing more than a reading of this book, with his worries that the employer's own belief system might be the greatest stumbling block to the drunken employee ever hearing about this new solution. He explicitly cautions the employer against any prejudice he might have against A's spiritual approach and the professed need for a drinking employee to acquire a spiritual experience to successfully stop drinking. Quote, after all, end quote, Hank says as he begins addressing the employer directly, quote, you are looking for results rather than methods, end quote, and quote, you will surely agree that it may be better to withhold any criticism you may have of our method until you see whether it works, end quote. In short, don't let your own beliefs prejudice you or your employee, against the essential spiritual element of AA's program of recovery. Continuing with this advice for, quote, what part employers might profitably take in salvaging their sick employees, end quote, Hank suggests that once the newly sober man returns to work, the boss, quote, call him in and ask him what happened, end quote, question him about his recovery and what he thinks he must do in order to preserve it. This invitation to an open conversation may result in the man admitting to shocking things, such as padding of his expense account or his earlier plan to steal the company's best clients and take them with him to another job. Revelations such as these are fairly normal. Parker says once a man has, quote, accepted his solution, which, as you know, demands rigorous honesty, end quote. However distressing these confessions may be, Hank advises the employer to, quote, charge this off as you would a bad account and start afresh with him, end quote. He also warns that problems with the man's home situation and with office politics once he is back on the job may also be expected and dealt with as quickly and fairly as possible. Parker contends that both of these call for candor and understanding on the part of the employer for, quote, the greatest enemies of alcoholics are resentment, jealousy, envy, frustration, and fear, end quote. The employer should avoid situations that generate these kinds of feelings at all costs, and anything he can do to reduce tensions will result in the newly sober employee professing, quote unquote, undying loyalty to the manager and to his company. Finally, Hank points out that the former alcoholic may now become a workaholic. If so, quote, don't let him work 16 hours a day just because he wants to. Encourage him to play once in a while. Make it possible for him to do so, end quote. And if he wants to work with other alcoholics in need of his help, even during business hours, quote, don't begrudge him a reasonable amount of time. This work is necessary to maintain his sobriety, end quote. Hank follows this with 3 catch-all paragraphs regarding what to expect from a man who has been sober for just a few months. First, he says, you may want to include him in conversations with other problem drinkers in your organization. He may be very helpful to you in these situations, even when dealing with more senior men. Second, it is critical that you completely trust this employee and not, for instance, become suspicious if he should call in sick one day. Nor should you worry about protecting him from any drinking situations that may normally arise in the course of his job. Finally, if he does have a slip, Parker says you must do your best to evaluate his sincerity about staying sober. Quote, if you are sure he doesn't mean business, there is no doubt you should discharge him. If, on the contrary, you are sure he is doing his utmost, you may wish to give him another chance, end quote. Hank then spends 3 paragraphs expounding his theories about how the work of recovery should be fruitfully pursued within a large corporation. He proposes that junior executives, who are often put in compromising positions because of their co-workers' drinking, be given the book to read. Once this has provided them with a sufficient understanding of alcoholism, they should then feel free to go to their drinking friends within the company and say something like this.
Look here, Ed. Do you want to stop drinking or not? You put me on the spot every time you get drunk. It isn't fair to me or the firm. I've been learning something about alcoholism. If you're an alcoholic, you're a mighty sick man. You act like one, the firm wants to help you get over it, if you're interested. There is a way out, and I hope you have sense enough to try it. If you do, your past will be forgotten, and the fact that you went away for treatment will not be mentioned. But if you cannot or will not stop drinking, I think you ought to resign.
Possibility that this scenario might actually work to the company's benefit or to the junior executive's benefit seems remote at best, and it's hard to believe Parker's was ever seriously committed to it. But somehow the idea of distributing the book and then encouraging conversations similar to this made perfect sense to him, and he confidently advocated that large companies adopt it as a way to ferret out and then reclaim the alcoholics within their organization. Quote, it boils right down to this, end quote, Hank says, quote, no man should be fired because he is an alcoholic. If he wants to stop, he should be afforded a real chance. If he cannot or does not want to stop, he should usually be discharged. The exceptions are few, end quote. In case the point has been somehow missed, Parkhurst once again highlights the financial benefits of addressing this problem. Quote, we don't expect you to become a missionary, end quote, he tells the employer. Quote, being a businessman is enough these days, but we can sensibly urge that you stop this waste and give your worthwhile man a chance, end quote. Doing so is just a good business decision. His final caution is against being one of those men who prefer to deny the problem rather than dealing with it, and he offers a story of a vice president of a large industrial concern who claimed confidently that, quote, we don't have any alcohol problem, end quote. Hank scoffed at this and categorically states this executive, quote, might be shocked if he knew how much alcoholism cost his organization a year, end quote. Hank advises the employer that if he is one of those who is ignorant or in denial about the extent of the alcohol problem within the company, quote, you might well take another look down the line. You might make some interesting discoveries, end quote. Since the reader is a businessman, Parkhurst presumes he would appreciate, quote, a summary of this chapter, end quote. So he offers the following 10 concise steps.
1. Acquaint yourself with the nature of alcoholism. 2. Be prepared to discount and forget your man's past. 3. Confidentially offer him medical treatment and cooperation, provided you think he wants to stop. 4. Have the alcohol thoroughly removed from his system and give him a suitable chance to recover physically. 5. Have the doctor in attendance present him with this book, but don't cram it down his throat. 6. Have a frank talk with him when he gets back from his treatment, assuring him of your full support, encouraging him to say anything he wishes about himself, and making it clear the past will not be held against him. 7. Ask him to place recovery from alcoholism ahead of all else. 8. Don't let him overwork. 9. Protect him, when justified, from malicious gossip. 10. If, after you've shot the works, he will not stop, let him go.
As a final testimony to the effectiveness of this approach, Hank closes, as he opened, with a bit of his own experience.
Today I own a little company. There are 2 alcoholic employees who produce as much as 5 normal salesmen. Why not? They have a better way of life, and they have been saved from a living death. I have enjoyed every moment spent in getting them straightened out. You, Mr. Employer, may have the same experience.
God is omitted from the text.
There are a few notable things in this chapter that distinguish it from those Wilson had already written. Most prominent is the complete omission of the word God from the text, a concrete example of the rule Hank had been urging on Bill for the past several months. In that same vein, the word spiritual appears only twice in this version of the chapter. Interestingly, both were deleted before the big book went to press, which may well imply they had been added by Wilson and then later removed by Parkhurst, returning the text to the purity he advocated with such consistency. More than that, it would have been easy to justify these 2 deletions, since they occur in these sentences that place unusual and distinctly unscientific responsibilities upon the physician attending the alcoholic. Quote, the doctor should approve a spiritual approach, and besides, he ought to tell the patient the truth about his condition, whatever that happens to be. The doctor should encourage him to acquire a spiritual experience, close quote. This sounds suspiciously like something Wilson might have added in the belief that the group's experience with Dr. Silkworth who enthusiastically supported the religious approach offered by AA, would prove to be the model for medical men across the country. That belief was optimistic in the extreme and not even true among doctors who actually took the time to read the book. So the deletion of these lines proved to be an excellent editorial decision. But beyond the expectation that doctors everywhere would rally to support AA's newfound spiritual solution, it seems like a strange and unlikely way to handle this situation. Why completely spare the employer the responsibility of recommending AA's explicitly religious solution while placing that task squarely on the doctor's shoulders? Why wouldn't the employer be the most likely person to recommend a spiritual approach to his employee, emphasizing the need to, quote, acquire a spiritual experience, end quote, if he wants to stay permanently sober? Why leave it to the doctor? Outside of these two later deleted references, Hank is consistently, even willfully, vague and ambiguous about spiritual issues, completely sidestepping the religious elements so prominently found in all the other chapters. Throughout, he barely makes passing mention of the spiritual aspects of, quote unquote, the program of recovery, and then only in the most offhanded ways, usually giving it a psychological spin. Parkhurst's most direct reference comes when he, as already noted, he advises the employer to tell his drinking employee, quote, he should understand that he must undergo a change of heart, and to get over drinking will require a transformation of thought, end quote. In keeping with his overall intentions, this suggests something much more like a psychological change than the religious transformation called for in the rest of the book. When at one point Hank does make explicit mention of the program's, quote, principles and procedures, close quote, he presumes these need no further explanation because the employer has just read the book where all of that is explained in detail. Beyond this, the only specific application of the program Parkhurst does mention is the need for the newly sober man to be rigorously honest, which he says is demanded of all who have accepted, quote unquote, our solution.
Read the book, but don't mention it to the employee.
Hank simply assumes the employer has not only read the book, but completely understood and digested its spiritual content, and then, in spite of any possible reservations he might have, decided to try this new approach with one of his more troublesome employees. This is a lot to presume, given Parkhurst's recent experience with his friend, the bank officer, who, after 2 hours of intense one-on-one conversation, still failed to understand the nature of alcoholism and the necessity of pursuing a spiritual solution. Even more strangely, the employer was also advised to make no mention whatsoever of the book to the alcoholic. This is in striking contrast to the advice Bill offered in To Wives, where he repeatedly encouraged the wife to bring the book to her husband's attention, even suggesting she read significant passages to him in an effort to engage his interest in the possibility of recovery. Hank, on the other hand, warns against even mentioning the book's existence. When first cross-examining the employee about his willingness to quit drinking, Parkhurst explicitly tells the employer not a word about this book. Not a word. Similarly, the junior executive is advised that, quote, he not and often should not show the book to the alcoholic prospect, close quote. The only person to be told about the book is the doctor. I suggest you draw our book to the attention of the doctor who is to attend to your patient during treatment. The doctor is then given the task of introducing the book to the alcoholic patient. Open parentheses, quote 5, have the doctor in attendance present him with this book, but don't cram it down his throat, close quote, close parentheses, and of making sure it is, quote, read the moment the patient is able while he is acutely depressed, if possible, close quote. Exactly why the book would prove to be such an effective tool in the wife's hands, and not the doctor's, but not in those of the employer or the junior executive, is never explained. Perhaps Parkhurst felt that asking him to advocate for the book was just too far outside the realm of good business practices, where a request to do so would put him in the possibly uncomfortable position of having to endorse a book and a particular solution that contained such specifically religious elements.
Despite whatever changes Bill Wilson may have made to this chapter, it still exhibits, especially as it was printed in the multilith copy, Hank Parkhurst's tendency to write in a wandering fashion, straying off topic with regularity and occasionally leaving out important connecting thoughts. This makes any logical, schematic outline of the chapter difficult, something that can only be done by ignoring the more distracting digressions. Parenthesis, for instance, the spinal fluid theory, close parenthesis, while simultaneously filling in the logical gaps which regularly appear in this chapter. Given this overall lack of organization, it is natural to wonder about the remarkable 10-point summary offered at the end. This list clearly, comprehensively, and concisely describes the message that can be difficult to decipher from any casual reading of two employers. Was this something Bill added to the text? It certainly seems to have been put in by someone who thought it was necessary to bring a bit more clarity to this rambling chapter. Whatever its origin, it was deemed redundant and unnecessarily, most likely by Hank Parkhurst himself, and this excellent numbered summary was deleted in the weeks just before the book went to press. This is unfortunate. Its clear communication with the employer was the goal of this chapter, then the removal of that list was a decidedly poor editorial decision. However disjointed and disorganized two employers may have been when it was first written, it shines like a positive beacon of clarity when compared to the next chapter Hank Parkhurst produced in the hopes that Bill Wilson would include it in the book.
End of chapter 20. Hank Parkhurst, managing editor, and two employers, read by, of course, Bill Schaberg, and we have Jim Worley with us and other members. Please unmute yourself and show some appreciation. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
guys.
Welcome,
Guys,
Paul.
thank you.
Reader.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Thank you very much.
Excellent.
Thank
Nicely done,
you.
everyone.
Mahalo nui.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Really good.
Thank you.
Really good.
I think, Bill, that was like being at a PI meeting. I was at once, a business meeting. I'm proud.
Guys. Good job.
Thank you, Dennis. Bill, did you want to make some observations on, since you've read it last?
Have we ever had a reading where I didn't want to make some comments, David?
Absolutely not, Mr. Schaberg.
I kept wondering when it was going to say, when this guy who wrote this chapter was going to say that in the book that started it all, the original manuscript, which by the way is going up for auction July 1st at Christie's. Be happy to talk about that in a minute. But Parkhurst is written on the page just opposite the forward, the blank page, a bunch of things. And the number one thing there says, business chapter should be rewritten. And that's in Hank Parkhurst's own handwriting. So he was talking about the multilith copy here. So obviously they did that with no problem. The other things just, I just love the fact he says he did one-on-one with this really smart guy who was president of a bank or something. 2 hours in his face, and the guy doesn't get it. But he expects, I don't know what, a 20-minute reading of this chapter is going to get everybody on board. It's almost, self-contradictory in that. I mean, I always kind of chuckle when I get to that part. I also chuckled a bit when we did Arthur Scott at the very beginning, the guy who volunteered to do a Christ-like edit on the text that Bill Wilson had sent him. He said he just couldn't help himself from editing anything that people sent him. Man, if you've ever sent me something to be read, you know that I can never help myself from editing it. I think I'm a better editor than a writer. I'm a wordsmith, man. I get going on that stuff. And I do that for local political candidates. Sarah and I went to a rollout for the candidate for probate judge. I helped get elected last time, and she said, "Yeah, we're gonna be sending you some stuff. We'll be sending you some stuff." So that's good. And then just this whole deal about Janet Blair. somebody that nobody knew about. Nobody knew about Janet Blair. Nobody had ever, I mean, there's no mention of her at all. And Michelle, the archivist for GSO, goes down to an archive committee meeting, an annual archive meeting down in Florida. And it's like, it was Janet Blair's niece or somebody. It was some sort of relation of Janet Blair who shows up at the thing and finds Michelle and donates these letters to her that Bill Wilson wrote to her, that Hank Parkhurst wrote to her, and that she wrote to them. And it's just like, man, you got to be kidding me. You know, I mean, I had two people call me from Florida saying, oh, we got these new letters and blah, 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 all this stuff. And then as soon as Michelle got back, she said, you need to take the train down. You need to come to New York and look at this stuff. But before that, so I mean, this is probably, I bet you it's like I researched and wrote this thing for 12 years and polished it for 12 years. Was probably year 7 or 8, which would make it, 2014, let's say, that this Janet Blair connection was discovered. Nobody knew anything about it.
Wow.
So talk about more will be revealed. And as most of you know here, there's been a bunch of that even since my book was published. But I just, we don't need to talk about the woman. What the hell, It was that high-powered dude that we talk about, that Tom Usel guy, It was a big deal. Anyhow, I was very, very, very happy to hear that you could do that. And by the way, Eamon asked me about ordering Jay's book before. So can you order my book, Writing the Big Book, in England and get a copy with no problem?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So I there's something going on there that I don't understand that I need to understand, because pretty soon I'm going to be self-publishing Writing the Big Book. If I can ever get my publisher to stop selling it online, which he no longer has the rights to do because he ceded them all to me.
That's good news, isn't it? That's good news.
What's good news?
That's good. That's good. So we'll go to Jim and Bill. We'll come back to you and we'll have that moment. You can tell us about the book that started it all at some point. But let's go to Jim while it's fresh in his mind. Jim, your impressions of the chapter.
Hi, David. Thanks. Really great chapter. Things jumped out at me that I have read before and they just slipped by, or my Alzheimer's got to me. I don't know, but I don't know. This might, win the prize for the least read chapter in the book. I don't know. I don't know if people really read it anymore. But the history behind it is fascinating, to me. And again, the effect or that non-alcoholics had on the final version. Janet Blair and Tom Wiesel and Dr. Howard and so many of these other people who really affected the outcome of the book. They probably did more writing and or subtraction and editing of the book than anyone else except Bill Wilson. And so that is just another example of that. And I think there is Bill and I have discussed this. There's one missing link in the chain, and that is the what's referred to once or twice as the raw manuscript. What was given to Tom Wiesel to edit. That seems to be, who knows where it is or what happened to it, or it disappeared. And then Tom Wiesel gave the what turned into be what we call the original manuscript that became the working manuscript, etc. But what was presented to Tom Wiesel and Janet, I'm sure, for final editing, what was that like? And what happened? Bill says, well, he cut it from 600 to 400 words and mostly out of the stories, and he moved my story up to the front of the page, and that's all we've got. But it would certainly be interesting to find that document if it still exists. But really, the history of the chapter is really interesting. So thank you.
Thank you. Hey, David, I follow up on what Jim just said. So they send Tom Usel the manuscript December 31st, January 1st. I'm not sure exactly when, but in that time zone. And he does work on it. And then he goes to Janet Blair. I think, and again, the date someplace in my book here, but it's like February 8th or something. They give her the manuscript. So now Tom Usel's already worked on it because he's already moved Bill Wilson's story to the front of the book. The first chapter in the book that Tom Usel got was There Is a Solution. And in There Is a Solution, the original write-up of it, it opened with Carl Jung talking to Roland Hazard, and it told half that story, and then the second half of the story ended up in the back half of There Is a Solution. This is the June 1938, There Is a Solution. So then Janet Blair gets the thing, and Wilson's story's been moved to the front. She's reading chapter 2, which is now There Is a Solution, and it says, like, we know a man who blah, 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 and she's like, she literally writes to these guys and says, look, I'm wickedly confused. Is this the same guy that I just read in this chapter? And what the hell's going on here? And she was also, I love the fact that you can go through Bill Wilson's story and number most of the steps, almost all the steps, and when she gets to how it works, she says, you just did this, and there is a solution. They talk about the solution. I said, you already did that in Bill's story. It's all in there. It's all in there. Sharp reader, that woman. Sharp reader, that woman. Really interesting. And Jim, I've never really thought about the amount of edits and writing, the impact it had. Like what's the percentage? Was Bill? What percentage was Hank? And what percentage was the rest of these people having this big impact? God knows. I mean, if you look through the book that started it all, you see all these U's crossed out in we's written on top of them. I have never gone through and counted all of those, but there's got to be somewhere between 100 and 200 of those. That's Dr. Howard. You got to stop being directive and you got to be suggestive. So, anyhow, are we having fun here or what?
Absolutely.
Could you talk about the auction? Oh, sorry. I spoke out of turn.
The auction.
Go on, Jim.
Yeah, the auction. So
I was keeping the auction on the end, but I just wanted to keep us going on this first. Is what I was doing. I just wanted to keep us going on this because that's a separate little topic for us. But I have to listen back to a lot of that great information we're going to post that on our WhatsApp channel later on. Jim and Bill Thornton there. That sounds fascinating information. I must listen to it again. Thomas Nice is in Iowa.
Yeah, Bill, were you ever able to document what grade Hank Parkhurst might have gotten in the writing skills class, or if he even passed it?
Oh, that's great. I never even thought of going to NYU or to Columbia, one or the other. That's such a great question. Never thought of that, Tom. You would think after all these years, somebody would have mentioned that even to my dense brain, but congratulations, you're the first. It's like somebody needs to go or contact the Diocese of New York because they gave the book to them and they got this thing about just they didn't like you talking about you get utopia, but let's not do that. And it was Ernie Kurtz who said to me, did you go to the Diocese of New York and look for that thing? And I was like, no, Ernie, I didn't. And it just sounded like too much of a tough deal. Jim?
Yeah, I've sent them an email twice to their archives people and no response, so I can keep trying to beat that dead horse, but they received the request and everything, but I'll keep trying.
Somebody, maybe I got to go down and knock on the door, plug that hole, that'd be good.
Thank you, guys. And Thomas was reading for us today. Thank you, Thomas Nias in Iowa. And another one of our readers is Gigi. We'll go to Gigi in Oregon.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Jim and Bill and all the readers, Steve and Tom and everybody else. I have a brief comment and then a brief question. The comment is where Hank Parkhurst is talking about the alcoholic in your organization. Is he not usually brilliant, fast thinking, imaginative, and likable? And in the new plain language book, that's a woman. Just incidentally.
Isn't she?
It's a she. Yes, it's a she, not brilliant.
Same adjectives, though.
Of course she is.
I would have to double check on that, but I'm pretty sure that they are. Yes. It's on page 123 in the plain language book, if anybody's interested. And then the question though that I have is, I don't think I've ever heard anybody ask this, but if they have, I haven't ever heard the answer. This friend that Parker spends 2 hours talking with about the man who was drinking, do we know who that was? Who later came in contact with our crowd?
No, that's another one of those
Cottage industry questions.
blank spots, you know. Hey, this is an anonymous program, damn it. You know, that's
I mean, I just figured, maybe it's something that I just missed. So
yeah, well, it would have been nice to brag about, right? I mean, if I was that guy, I'd be telling people, "Oh, I'm in that chapter that Hank wrote. I'm in there, baby," you know.
for real. Okay, thanks.
And it also could be a made-up story.
Could be.
Stories, not a story. Gigi, thank you very much. And Donna is from Ohio. I beg your pardon, Ohio.
Hi, I'm really glad I found this this group on Fridays. It's so interesting to me. My question is Tom Uzel the same person that helped Bill write the 12 and 12? Is that the same person?
He had nothing to do with that. I haven't done the real research. I haven't done the research on that. Somebody needs to do a thing on the 12 and 12. But it was, supposedly he was helped in that by a number of people. Tom Powers, thank you, his right-hand man there, they had this big fight. And also his sponsor, well, I didn't call him his sponsor, but the Jesuit, Father
Dowling.
Father Dowling, thank you. See, if Jim wasn't here with this, I'd be just
good.
Idiot, so at least those two. I think there was somebody else though. I recently read someplace somebody else who
Jack Alexander also helped him. Father Ford after Father Dowling got sick, and there's also an Ed P. and Betty Love.
Wow, that's a lot.
All kinds of editors.
Jim done a presentation for us, didn't you, on that? So you did a presentation.
Yes, I did. It's entitled "Writing the 12 and 12."
And you also did one on Tom Powers. It's just bringing it back to my memory.
Yeah, I did one on Tom Powers.
Where can I watch that?
Go on to Growing and Understanding Group website. Be on there. I think last year that was, so 25. You get it. I'll try and get the link for you before the meeting is over. I'll try and do that.
And one more question.
Oh, good. Yes, go ahead, Donna. There's no one next. Oh, there is. Robert is next. Go ahead.
Mr. Schauber, do you have any more plans to write another book?
Absolutely not. I'm 82 years old. I don't have the bandwidth, the energy, or the time.
82. That's physical, Bill. We're talking spiritually. No age.
I think you got another book in you.
Sir.
David, I gotta take an hour nap every day, and most especially before doing this thing, I need to take an hour nap just to get ready.
Yes.
So
we appreciate it very much, sir.
I find that I give a false impression of my energy level when I'm doing these things because I get into it and I get cranked up. But then afterwards, bang.
Wilson said many alcoholics are enthusiasts. They run to extremes. I love that. I love that line.
Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. You're finished. Thank you very much. I'm going to Robert J.
Thank you, Bill, for the topic. On the employers, on that banker employee, was he Clarence Snyder?
No. I doubt that very, very much. Very much. If that was true, Clarence would have claimed that he was, that he was, believe me, Clarence would have claimed any little piece of credit he could possibly get for being a founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. So if he was mentioned in the book, I'll guarantee you Clarence would have told everybody about it, so no, I would discount that,
Okay, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Now, if we've no one else coming in, we'll go, Bill, we can get that, the book that started it all. You were talking about an auction of some sort, or something's happening there.
Yeah, Christie's is auctioning that book on Wednesday, July 1st. It's the Jim Irsay auction. And there's, I don't know how many items there are, 150 items. Don't quote me on how many items there is. And I think it's the next to the last thing, or the last thing that's being auctioned off. Now, I haven't gone and looked this up yet, but I know that if you go on the Christie's website, someplace there, they'll tell you how you can link in and watch that thing live. It's all online.
Wow.
That's a live feed online. So, I've been on auctions online. I actually bought a first edition copy of Darwin's Origin of the Species from Christie's online one time, and but I definitely plan on getting there and doing that. So we'll see.
If you go, anyone's interested, if you go to AA History Only Facebook page, there's a link there that talks about that. And it also has some history that I believe may have been written by someone here, Mr. Shaber, history of the book that started it all in the manuscript. And there's a whole story, the whole chain of custody and everything about it. So it was posted, I think, yesterday or the day before about the auction and the history of the book. And there's a link on there where you can, the suggested price, get your checkbook out. The suggested price is between $1 and $2 million is what they're expecting. So it'll be interesting to see. And there's a link on there that you can go right into Christie's website.
Yeah, I wrote the first little 3 or 4 paragraphs of that. Christie's called me. I consulted with Sotheby's the second time it was at Sotheby's auction also. But they called me up and asked me to help with that. So I wrote that preface thing, and then I corrected a whole bunch of stuff they had, in the write-up they did on it, where they were just, it was close but no cigar on some of the facts. So and they took all the edits. So that was good. Why wouldn't they?
Interesting.
It's funny how these weird little things, right? So they talk about Hank Parkhurst and Bill Wilson, and then 3 paragraphs later they're talking about Hank P. and Bill W. I was like, look, you got to either do the last names or the initials. You can't be doing both. It's freaking confusing, dudes. And they were like, oh, we didn't even notice that. Oh, we didn't notice we were doing that. So I said, I suggest full names.
Bill, right on the 1:30 hour. We people want to stay behind, I can get that link for you for Jim Worley's presentations if you want to stay behind for that. Bill, I'll get ready here to put up on the screen the evening gather. We missed it last week, Bill. We missed it. You were missed, Bill, I'll be honest. You were missed, but we had you, we were reading your words on chapter 1, which is my favorite chapter of all chapters. Because, Bill, as you know, without chapter 1, so did you have to go back and rewrite chapter 1 after you got the new information on Janet Blair, or any time? Did you have to go back and when did you write chapter 1? That's a good question. When did you put chapter 1 together? When did you kind of get chapter 1, compile it together and say, I'm finished with chapter 1?
I wrote 6 chapters, starting with the Counting Noses meeting and going forward from there, and gave them to 6 different readers, 3 AA people and 3 non-alcoholics. And the AA people all knew the backstory, but the non-alcoholics didn't know the backstory. They didn't like, how the hell did these guys get to Ohio in 1937? What are we talking about? So I realized I had to tell the front story. And then when I realized that and thought about it, I thought I hadn't really done a serious critique. I had put the little critique in different spots in the book already, but I thought I could tell that first story, starting with a kitchen table story, and show some of the problems with that. And I could do the, go into, and Dr. Bob's got the wrong date, and Bill number 3 wasn't number 3, all of that stuff so it allowed me to tell the story while I was showing the problems of credibility that I had to deal with as I was going through this. And by the way, David,
Yeah.
this week, it came, somebody here pointed out to me, I don't know, a couple of years ago, one of these readings, that Ebby made 2 visits to Bill before Bill ended up in the hospital. And the second visit was with
Shep.
with Shep Cornell. And Bill, so I was like, where is that? Well, it's in one of Bill Wilson's recordings in the book that's in my first 40 years. So I went and looked at that, and it was right there. And it was really great because Bill did not like Shep at all. I think he called him a panty waist, and somebody who had just had a few cocktails after the golf match in the country club kind of thing, But just last week, I thought to myself, I've always been challenged by the fact that Ebby's story is so different from Bill Wilson's story that Wilson had to be really, really, really working it to come up with his version of that whole thing. And last week I thought to myself, no, there were 2 visits. And what he did was he conflated the 2 of them, just put them together, remembered the simplicity of the second one and left out all the details of the first one. And, I suspect the second time they sat around the kitchen table, to tell you the truth. But it never occurred to me that Wilson wasn't just taking Ebby's first visit to him and completely changing it radically. All of a sudden I was thinking, oh, maybe he's just conflating those 2 things together. Something, of course, I've never done in my memory myself, but I've read about how that works, and
Thomas was going to come in. I want to just ask you about, is that when you decided to call him a myth maker, or when did you decide to say he was going to be? When did that term come upon you? I know we're taking up time.
That was a great place right there, and also the fact, that when I was writing the story about the county noses meetings, I got Lois's diary, and Lois's diary doesn't read anything like this story Bill Wilson told over and over and over again, and this is a diary she wrote that day. Come on, give me a break. Bill's out there by himself. No, he's there with Lois. Oh, and he brought some New York people with him. And, all this stuff just goes on and on and on. I was like, what the hell's going on here?
You've revealed a lot of it to us. Thank you. Thomas, nice. What do you want to say, Tom? And then we go back to Bill for the evening gather.
They say that Dr. Bob would tell people that if you talk longer than 20 minutes, you're just repeating yourself. But this Hank Parkhurst is suggesting that this Janet Blair should be able to withstand Bill Wilson sharing his experience and his story for 3 to 4 hours. I tell you, if somebody suggested that to me, I wouldn't even return the phone call.
Yeah, or bring a bottle with you because I'm going to need some lubrication, one or the other. Okay.
She was getting paid in all fairness. So, so we go close with the evening gather. Bill Schaberg, sir. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Oh, David. I sometimes I mention this, sometimes I don't, but what I love about the Buddhist Gathas are that they're all personal. It's like when I say a food Gatha, it's like, may I remember my desire to eat with moderation. It's about me. William, remember this stuff. So the only way this kind of makes sense to me, especially these days, is to make it very personal. So let me respectfully remind you, William, life and death are of supreme importance. Time swiftly passes by and opportunities are lost. You need to strive to awaken to the present moment. Take heed. This very night, your days are diminished by 1. You're 82 years old. Don't squander what little life you got left in you.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill.
Everyone. And next week we're back with chapter
Thank
21,
you.
the Q&A chapter, and we're going to November 1938.
Amazing.
See you all next week.
See you, Bill. Looking forward
See
to
you
it.
all
Thank you,
next
Bill.
week. Thank
Thank
you
you,
so
Bill.
much.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care. Thank you.
Thanks for your
Thank you,
night, all.
David.
Thank you.
Time for my nap.
Thanks,
Paula.
David.
Bye.
Thanks,
Jim Worley.
thanks a
Thank you,
million.
Jim.
Thanks a million.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Dennis. Dina, thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you,
Have a
everyone.
great night.
Tim, how you doing? You okay, Tim?
Got his hand up.
Yeah, the only comment I was going to make was the thing about memory. You know, the more they study memory, human memory is highly imperfect. Every time we recall a memory, we have to rewrite
Yeah.
the memory. The memory is not really stored in any solid or electrical form. It's kind of there, and every time you recover it, it gets rewritten to your brain again. So, you know, some of us are better at rewriting than others. Bill Wilson obviously did a whole lot of rewriting and conflating and other things, but it's not unusual for that to happen with people. It's just
Or
not.
would you say even your understanding, my understanding of memories changes as I get older as well? Would you go there?
Yeah, they've done a lot of research on it the last 10, 15, 20 years, and I don't think the understanding of it now by the scientists it's nothing like what they thought it was
And
40
even my
years
own
ago.
understanding, Tim, of a situation that happened to me maybe when I was drinking, even my understanding of
Yeah.
that now completely, I'm looking at it from a different perspective on, you know.
Right.
I can see the glass is half full in that situation now. That when I was drinking, I didn't appreciate anything, kind of, you know. It's an
Right.
interesting way of telling the story, isn't it? It's all great. I love it. I love all these things. You know, once you kind of start pulling back at it and you get into the source of this AA, it's an incredible thing, isn't it? It's an incredible thing how it all came about. It just, and here we are, you know, nearly 100 years down the road.
I'm just amazed by how enjoyable it is rereading this book. You know, the third or the fourth or the fifth time. It's like, well, yeah, we several of us been through it multiple times, but it's intriguing and different every time we go through it. Really is.
Absolutely, because we can focus on. There's so many components to it, Tim.
Yeah.
There's so
New
many
things come out every time. Right.
Even
It's
today,
a very
we could-
deep, involved book.
Even today, we could have spent another hour just talking about one snippet of something. You know, it's just
Yep.
it's
Yeah.
the gravitas of it all. It's just phenomenal. And we didn't miss it, Tim. We were there at the beginning when it came off the press. Good. Now I'm going to go and have a cup of tea. We're back tomorrow. I don't know if you'd like to come back, but we're coming back tomorrow. We're reading A Great Responsibility. We started reading it. Pat, Steve, and myself have started reading this book. So we have it on the Kindle as well. So A Great Responsibility. I'm fascinated reading it from their narrative. What narrative they're trying to pitch. You know, considering what we all know about the history of AA and the stories, it's fascinating seeing how they're trying to make it all knit together to tell their narrative. And it must have been a committee thing. We don't know exactly who wrote it or who wrote it. We don't know exactly who was the wordsmith.
Wrote that book? Don't know who wrote that book.
We don't know who wrote it. It was done by, I guess, the subcommittee of the General Service Office. It's AA approved, so we don't know. So they must have selected a committee, and then someone in the committee must have been nominated to, I don't know who did it, maybe 3 or 4 of them. I don't know. They must have compiled a lot of these talks and chosen which ones they wanted to choose, blah, 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 blah. You know, so they had an agenda, of course. I'm not knocking the agenda. Good luck to them. They have to tell a story, and it's saving millions of lives. So let's not forget that, you know. But I don't want to be gaslit anymore.
He's not going to stand for it.
Don't be gaslighting me. You can't gaslight me anymore. I'm armed with the facts.
Yeah.
Nice. You got your hair cut, Dina, did you?
Yes, I did. Thank you for noticing.
There you go. I still have the charm. I notice these things about ladies. I've always noticed things about ladies.
Cool.
There you go.
All right. Well, I can't wait to hear about all that tomorrow.
Good stuff. We see you tomorrow, so. See you, Tim. Good to see you, Zels.
Night night.